Okay.
Okay, good.
So welcome to everybody. I think it's Lackawanna and Lehigh represented today. So I'm really glad that you're here. Just briefly, can you introduce yourself and what church you're connected with? And are you a ruling elder or a teaching elder? I'm Rhonda Cruzy, and I am I'm a teaching elder. I'm the transitional presbytery leader for Lehigh. And Martha, why don't you go? Martha Cox.
Sorry, Martha Cox, First Presbyterian Lehighton. I am a ruling elder, clerk of session, and currently preaching at Lehighton.
Amanda?
Amanda Roberts. I'm connected to Clark Summit Presbyterian Church. I'm a member there. I'm a ruling elder, not currently serving on session, but serving on COM.
Lucky you. And
No,
Jen.
it's lapsed from my presbytery.
Jen.
I'm Jen Baer. I'm the clerk of Lackawanna Presbytery, and I'm a pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Dallas, Pennsylvania.
Okay. Nikki.
I am Nicole Vogel. I go by Nikki, as many of you know. I am the teaching elder at East Stroudsburg Presbyterian Church.
Gail.
Wait, I'm admitting someone. Hi, I'm Gail Watts from First Pres Bethlehem, and I am a ruling elder.
Okay. Marcia.
Marcia Hyman. I'm a ruling elder, not currently sitting on session at First Allentown, and retired stated clerk.
Okay.
But still stuck on COM.
Jean.
I'm Jean Bigger. I'm a member at Dunmore Presbyterian, and I'm a ruling elder, not currently serving on the session, and the secretary for the COM.
Martha Jordan.
I'm Martha Jordan. I am a teaching elder, transitional teaching elder at First United Presbyterian of West Pittston and Wyoming Presbyterian Church, and I am serving on COM.
Okay. Aren't you a co-chair?
No, I'm moderator of the presbytery, so that kind of was my limit.
Oh, okay. Lynn.
Wait, let me see if I can unmute you.
Thank you. I'm okay.
Okay.
I can start my video. I'm Lynn Ingram. I'm a resting elder from Faith Presbyterian Church in Emmaus. I served as clerk for 12 years, and I'm on my second year on the COM.
Cool. And Gary.
Hello, Gary Perna, elder of First Presbyterian Church in Monty City and chairman of COM for Lehigh Presbytery.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming. I really hope that it's helpful, that we have some good conversation. Please, I think it'd be helpful if you mute yourself unless you're asking a question, just so there's not all this, dogs and doorbells sounds. But please feel free to raise questions or concerns or whatever. So let's open with prayer. Gracious God, thank you for this beautiful day and for the blessings that this day holds for us. We thank you for each of the people gathered here today and for your call upon them to serve the church. We thank you for the gifts that you have given them that they bring to this service. We pray for all of the churches represented here, as well as the churches in our presbyteries, Some are struggling more than others, and we know that you hold them and guide them through your Spirit. We ask your blessings on those in our midst who are struggling with coronavirus, whether they're ill or they are living in fear, whether they are trying to figure out how to be church in the midst of the pandemic. We pray your blessings on our time here today, that we may learn from one another. And we pray in Christ's name, amen. All right, let's see if I can. Oh, host, you have to allow me to screen share. Down at the bottom where it says screen share, I think you can allow somebody else to do that.
The three buttons next to your name, the three dots, one of them says allow. If you click on it, one of them says allow to screen share under participants. We had to do this yesterday. When was that ordination we did? 2 days ago. 2 days ago.
We can't hear you either.
So I have, oh, here's the, okay, sorry. No, I'm not seeing the screen share. Give me another clue.
Down at the bottom?
Yeah, I mean, I see multiple participants.
Yeah, try
Okay.
that.
All right, sorry. Did that get you there?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Okay, you guys see the screen?
Yep.
The slide? Okay, cool. So this is what I'm planning to talk about today is just sort of where the church is right now and what is the work of the COM, and then specifically what is the role of the liaison. And then we're going to talk a little bit about conflicts and crises, which is always fun. And I'm promising no more than 2 hours, hopefully less than that. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because we all sort of have our own ideas of, the church and in various states of decline or not. But I think it's important to review the context in which our churches find themselves just briefly. And this is a Gallup poll. There's no surprise. Church membership among U.S. adults has declined from a high of 76% were members of a church, synagogue, or mosque in the 40s, down to 50% last year. And again, that's probably no surprise to anybody. And just a snapshot, we have clergy who are aging. Churches, many of them struggle to connect with millennials and Gen Zers. The influence of the church has decreased a lot in recent decades, and credibility along with that. Increasingly, the United States is secularizing, and people have very little loyalty anymore, not very little, but not as much loyalty to a particular denomination or even a congregation. Americans are no longer joiners of institutions. they don't want to be members necessarily. They prefer to be participants, which in our particular polity is concerning because we count members and base per capita on that. And so that's something that's really affecting our churches. And then the divisiveness in our culture and the increasing racial tensions that does carry over into church life. It affects our churches. Sunday has become just another work day. For much of our culture, people don't necessarily have that day set aside, particularly to go to church. And then there's a couple of ways to describe our culture that I've seen that were interesting. One is a digital Babylon. So we're sort of exiled in a world in which always connected smart devices and search algorithms are educating and entertaining people. And so that's the new context for discipleship is the smart devices and people always digitally connected. And then another writer described our culture as a liquid culture, which refers to the fact that our culture is always changing, constantly changing circumstances. And as soon as we get used to one thing, it changes. So, does anybody have anything to add to that? Ways that our culture is affecting our churches, or things that our churches are struggling with? You would add to that?
Amanda?
Yeah,
Just that Sunday is also a sports day.
that's true. That's true. Yeah. So talking about another reality that our churches are facing is that they're becoming too small to support a full-time pastor, or in some cases, any kind of pastor. So in addition to maintaining their church building, they can't afford both a pastor and supporting the building. So this was interesting, and the average worship attendance, that's what AWA is, to support a full-time pastor, you need on average 150 members, or 150 in worship. So that's more members. But the current average worship attendance in the US is about 75. So that shows you that many of our churches are not able to afford a pastor. So I wanted to look at our presbyteries, speaking of size of congregations, and this is the three presbyteries, Northumberland, Lehigh, and Lackawanna. And look at how many and what percentage of our members, of our churches, are under 50 members. And that's not worship attendance, that's membership. It ranges from a third to a half of our churches. So we're really talking about some small struggling churches. We all know that, but this sort of quantifies it. And not very many of our churches, in Lehigh, we have 14 full-time pastors. Some of those are associates. So we don't have 14 churches with full-time pastors. And Lackawanna, for 44 churches, you have 11 full-time pastors. So, our churches, we all know this, but this sort of quantifies how small they are. So what does this say about the future of our churches, I guess, is what I really wanted to take from this. And then, of course, there's COVID. And we still don't know the impact that the pandemic is going to have on our churches, large and small. Who knows really where we're going to go from here, but certainly the church is going to be changed. And I thought it was interesting because I saw some recent data that said that 1 in 3 practicing Christians has stopped attending church during COVID. And practicing Christians, they mean the Barna group says that those are who identify as Christian and agree strongly that faith is very important in their lives and attend church at least monthly prior to COVID. So these are, pretty faithful attenders. And this is broken down by age group. So boomers is the first one. Can you all see that? It's not too small. Okay. And then the Gen X and millennials. And it's they've stayed at the same church, or they've switched churches, or they've stopped attending. So I thought that was interesting. So essentially, at least a third of practicing Christians has dropped out. So how is this going to impact our churches in the long run? We don't know that. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the work of the Committee on Ministry. That is sort of the context in which we're working in. But it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, we do have some churches who are thriving and growing and doing great, including the smallest of them. Some of our smallest churches are really doing good ministry. So let's talk about the Committee on Ministry and how we as committees work with our churches. And of course, we have to start with the Book of Order. Section G-30303 talks about the presbytery's relations with sessions, and tells us that presbytery has a particular responsibility to coordinate and guide and encourage and support and resource the work of the congregations, to help them be the most effective witness to the broader community that they can be. And in order to do this, it tells us that the presbytery has authority to counsel, advise, serve as a mediator, if there's conflict, to correct the situation with the rules of discipline, or to put in an administrative commission, and as a last resort, assume original jurisdiction. And then if we go a little further, G-3.307, it gives us a fuller description of the presbytery's responsibilities to ministers of word and sacrament and the congregations. It says each presbytery shall develop and maintain mechanisms and processes to serve as pastor and counselor to its ministers of the word and sacrament, commissioned pastors, and certified Christian educators of the presbytery, to facilitate the relations between the presbytery and its congregations, ministers of the word and sacrament, and to settle difficulties on behalf of the presbytery where helpful and where possible and expedient. And it says to facilitate the presbytery's oversight of inquirers and candidates, reception and oversight of minister of the word and sacrament members, approval of calls for pastoral services and invitations for temporary pastoral services, oversight of congregations without pastors, dissolution of relationships, dismissal of members, and its close relationship with both member congregations and ministers of the sacrament. The presbytery may delegate its authority to designated entities within the presbytery. And that is what we call the Committee on Ministry and the Committee on Preparation for Ministry. We have those two entities that are tasked with representing the presbytery to do all of those things that I just named. So, who gets our attention as the Committee on Ministry? Typically, at least with any Committee on Ministry I've ever worked with, it's the person with, or the church with the loudest voice, the squeaky wheel, whatever you want to call it. Typically, there are a few churches who get a larger portion of COM's time and energy. They're the ones, and you all know who they are, whose pastors or clerks or sessions demand your attention for one reason or another, pretty consistently. And then there are churches who, for one reason or another, are in crisis. And we'll talk more about what that looks like later. But they may think they're in crisis, but we don't necessarily see it as a crisis. So whose definition of crisis are we talking about? Are they acting out, or is there really a problem? So this is why COM work is also often referred to as putting out fires. There's always somebody, some church having some sort of a problem. So how can Committee on Ministry be more proactive and less reactive with our congregations? At least 80% of our congregations are struggling in some way. We'll talk a little bit about that later. They're either financially struggling, they're having conflict, there's no pastoral support, or maybe they have the wrong pastor, there's a lack of energy, a decline in attendance, they're trying to adapt to the changing culture. So how can the Committee on Ministry proactively respond to our churches and assure them that they're not alone, and that we are there to partner with them and support them rather than waiting for a conflict or a crisis? Is there another way to allocate the Committee on Ministry's attention? And some do it by church size. Some committees on ministry sort of divide, them up and by grouping according to size, and allocate number of liaisons based on that. Maybe you focus on the small churches who need sort of a little boost, or maybe you focus on the large churches who are doing pretty well and could use some encouragement. Or what about basing it on church health? There is a great book called Autopsy of a Deceased Church, and I really highly recommend it. It's very small and easy to read. It has an unfortunate title, which tends to scare people off, but the subtitle is 12 Ways to Keep Yours Alive. And the author looked at churches that had closed, and he saw similarities or symptoms, if you will, of sick and dying congregations. And the book describes what some of those symptoms are, so the church can say, oh, well, that sounds like us. Let's do something about it before it's too late. So Rayner, the author, and others agree that of churches in the US, just generally, about 10% are considered healthy churches. 40% exhibit some symptoms of sickness, and we'll talk about what that is. 40% are very sick, and 10% of our churches are actively dying and probably don't have much time left. So how does he describe a sick church? A sick church is one that they believe their best days are in the past. They've seen a decline in average worship attendance in the past 5 years. They've been gradually moving from outwardly being outwardly focused to being inwardly focused. They really are not doing any disciple making, and they may be busy, they may have activities, but they don't really have a purpose. They're doing things, but not with any goal or purpose in mind. And then very sick churches, as he defines them, you have to have at least 3 of these. They've had significant numerical decline in the past 10 or 20 years, prolonged times of just sort of apathy. A lot of people have sort of given up. Sometimes this leads to conflict. The church is one that the community doesn't even know. They know there's a building there, but they don't know if there's still people coming in and out of that building. They don't know what they're about. They may have rarely get new members or even visitors. If they've had pastors recently, it's been sort of a revolving door, and the good old days for a very sick church are at least 20 years in the past. Anybody have any comments? Does that make sense? Do you know churches like that?
I think it's helpful to have this description of, I guess, descending health. So as liaisons, we can be aware and awake to what's happening there, and help where we can. But I find this written piece really helpful.
Okay, well, I can send it to you, but again, I really encourage you to read the book because I think it's really helpful. So how do we stay connected with our churches? There are several opportunities for the Committee on Ministry to make connections with churches, and we're going to address a couple of them today, and then we're going to talk about the routine liaison connections and conflict and crisis events. And then session 2, we'll talk about pastoral transitions and leadership conversations, which previously have been known as triennial visits and all kinds of different things. The role of the liaison. So you've been elected to the Committee on Ministry. Congratulations. Before we start, how are each of your, or how is Lackawanna set up in terms of liaisons? Are you assigned specific churches or?
So we don't have your typical liaison program where like every 3 years you go and visit. They did at one point, but they stopped it. And last year, I think it was, we started a liaison program where it's churches are visited by somebody, and it may not be a person on COM, to kind of just ask some questions, make sure they know what's going on in the life of the presbytery. But in theory, every church should be visited every year through this liaison program.
Yeah. Okay.
Some did a better job than others.
Well, yeah. Well, in Lehigh, we have and how many do you have on your COM right now?
9.
9.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to say, if 50% of the churches were visited during that period, that we had a rather long questionnaire for them, that 50% would be a high number.
Yeah.
And it was assigned to elders, not necessarily those connected with COM.
Okay.
And ministers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And ministers.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in our presbytery, we have, what do we currently have? 8 or 9? 8, I think. We're at about half of what the number of slots we have. We are about at half staff, and every member is assigned what, 2 or 3 churches, something like that. And then, but we also have it divided up into groups, like Lynn oversees and Gail works with her on transitions. So whenever there's a church in transition, they go in and talk to them. And then Marcia oversees sort of administrative work of COM. And then we also have a conflict team. And Nicole, how many people, you're part of that too, right? How many people are in that?
It's just basically me and Gary at the moment.
Oh, okay. Okay. So we try to also have sort of specialties within the COM. So anyway, so.
I'm sorry, were you calling me, Rhonda?
Nope.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. So you've been assigned a group of churches that you will serve as the COM liaison. So what does that mean? Well, in a nutshell, the role of the liaison is to provide encouragement and communication and support for the pastors, the congregations and session, or the moderators if they don't have a pastor, to offer them appropriate resources, to keep committee on ministry informed about what's going on with the congregation, their challenges, their successes, their needs, and in short, sort of support the congregational relationship between the presbytery and the congregation, or connectional relationship. So it really is a connection between the presbytery and the church. So the first thing that I would recommend when you're assigned to a congregation is to contact the moderator, introduce yourself, provide your contact information to them so that they know that you are the person who is representing Committee on Ministry right now. Ask them to be added to their newsletter, if it's an email newsletter, or their email list, so that when announcements go out about that church, you're aware of them. You might read the most recent annual report or something just to get a sense of the church. Something else that's important is to ask others on COM who have worked with that church in the past about any historical information, their relationship with the presbytery, for example, because some of those are sort of fraught and you don't want to step into something. If there are key events in their history that are important to know about. And then request a visit to an upcoming session meeting. And again, this should be once a year. It doesn't have to be more than that, but at least go and introduce yourself, talk about your role, leave your contact information, listen, learn about what's going on, bring any information or resources that you can come up with from the presbytery. Invite elders to sign up for the presbytery newsletter, and then follow up with them. If you tell them that you're going to, add their names to the email list, make sure you do it. If they ask you a specific question about a specific resource, make sure you get it to them. Some liaisons like to attend worship if you can. If you're a pastor, then that's hard for you to do. And I would encourage liaisons to pay particular attention to new pastoral relationships. If it's a pastor who's in their first year, that's really a critical time for a liaison to be attentive. And we'll talk more about that later. And keep in touch with the moderator and the clerk by phone or email. I would say once a month. Just send them an email and say, so how are things going? Anything you need? How can COM support you? It doesn't have to be a long thing. Just consistently reaching out and saying, I'm here. And then I think it's important to report back to Committee on Ministry every month, for liaisons to say, yeah, I talked to whatever pastor, and things seem to be going fine, or they're worried about budgeting or whatever, just so that the committee as a whole has a sense of what's going on there. Does all of that make sense? Does it sound overwhelming? Is that sort of what you've been doing? Yeah. At our COM meetings, we haven't been reporting in about the churches unless there is a crisis or a problem. And I think it's probably good to start doing that, just so that we know that we're checking in on the churches and keeping connected with them.
I wanted to say that I actually haven't connected with my churches yet. I was waiting for this training to feel more confident about doing so. And it was helpful for you to spell out like the frequency and the specific expectations. So thank you for that.
Oh, that's okay. I just think that there needs to be like I said, a consistent presence or connection, not necessarily presence, but being connected to the church on a regular basis.
Rhonda, I would also like to say that not all churches want you being in constant contact with them. I mean, they kind of repel you and try to brush you off, but you just have to be persistent, because once you do get your foot in that door and they find out how helpful you can be or how supportive you are, especially if they're having problems and you can kind of help them work through it, then they'll come around. But boy, doors are sometimes when you show up.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's helpful to talk to other people on COM and say, what's been the relationship with the presbytery in the past? And there may have been some conflict or something that happened that it'd be helpful to know about. But yeah, I mean, as long as they know that you're not coming to judge them, criticize them, hold them up to some list of standards, I think it's just, I'm here to support you in however way I can. I think that'll go a long way. So again, it's important to show up. That's really one of the keys to being a successful liaison, is on a regular basis, whether it's a quick phone call or an email, once a year in person, to be the face of the Committee on Ministry or the presbytery. Really keep up with what's happening, build a relationship, be one of the connections in our connectional system. And I said pay particular attention to new pastoral relationships. Some presbyteries do sort of an end of first year review, which is really helpful, because if things are not going well after 1 year, then you really need to know about it so that you can sort of preempt a conflict coming up. Sometimes a pastor may come in and just sort of want to be liked and doesn't want to rock the boat, and really isn't doing anything. It may be, when you talk to the session, it may just be a love feast, but you may know that there's not really much going on. Or sometimes a pastor will come in and start changing things and questioning things and criticizing their lack of energy or whatever. And then when you go in there, it's just a train wreck because they don't like the person and the pastor is frustrated. And that I've seen that at the end of a first year review, and it's really hard to sort of turn that around. And then there's somewhere in between where the pastor is has been developing relationships, but also has been sort of challenging the status quo and helping them name their reality, maybe encouraging them to do some experimenting. So that's what hopefully you see. But it's not a performance review. It's not like you're going in there and reviewing the pastor. Basically, it's a check-in to see how things are going on both sides. It used to be that a new pastor would have this luxury of not changing anything for 1 year. And that was sort of a rule of thumb, but you can't do that anymore because churches are really, for one thing, some of our contracts are short-term, a supply pastor or something, and it's a 1-year contract. But also, for some of these churches, time is short, and there really is a sense of urgency. So hopefully with new pastors, if something does come up, you'll be able to know about it so that the committee can do something. And then the second thing, you show up and follow up. It's really important in this relationship to do what you say you're going to do. If they ask about something and you don't respond, or you say you'll do something and then you don't, you lose their trust, and then they can pile on to their oh yeah, the presbytery doesn't do anything, and so you really want to sort of represent the presbytery in a good way, and the reputation of the presbytery. So are there questions, concerns? Do you have to go to the bathroom? Anything? You guys are very not talkative this morning.
I guess I have a comment, not necessarily
Okay.
related to Liaison. I found it easiest for me to, and I use Gmail, to put a label on all of those in my Liaison list, and I can write one email and black carbon copy it to myself and send a blanket, I'm your liaison, yada, yada, yada. And it goes out to all of them, and then they can respond separately, but nobody sees who the others are.
Yeah.
It makes it faster when you're trying to send emails and keep in touch with them. That's all. Just a suggestion.
Okay. Do you get responses?
I've gotten, well, sort of. I've gotten a response from all 3 of the churches that I'm the liaison to, not necessarily through email. So.
Okay. Okay. Does anybody else have any stories of positive or negative responses when you reach out?
I also have churches that I know people in, so that's kind of helpful.
Right. That is helpful. Okay. So moving on to conflicts and crises. Sometimes stuff just happens. And this is probably the hardest part about being on Committee on Ministry, and why some people refuse to serve on this committee. Inevitably, we're all human, and there's going to be conflict. And sometimes they can get nasty and decidedly unchristian. But that's sort of what we're here for, is to work through some of those things. So conflict is hard. It's what we don't want to see. And some part of us hopes that church people will all love each other and get along, and we don't want to see sort of the seamier side of church life. We don't want to hear how dreadfully people treat each other, but the church isn't full of saints, it's full of sinners, and so there you go. So what are some potential conflicts that might come up in one of your churches? Or maybe you've already had this happen.
I think power struggles within either PNCs or within sessions. Sometimes the smaller churches have, people who either have given a lot of money or have been there a long time and seem to think that they should be running the church, but they don't necessarily are not serving on any, board.
Right. Okay. So conflict among church members. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I think sometimes that power struggle also is with the pastor, and, at times a new pastor that comes in, it can be a challenge because they have functioned a certain way for so long. So whether it's the organist or a secretary, it can be really challenging to figure out some of those dynamics.
Right. Okay. So sometimes it's pastor and other staff, or pastor and the congregation, pastor and the session. So those are all kinds of potential conflicts.
I think sometimes there's conflict about people are concerned that the church is dying and they don't know how to express that concern. And so it just manifests itself in conflicts that aren't really about what they seem to be about on the surface.
Right. Right.
I think conflict also with finances and with maintaining buildings.
Yep. Yep. Those are all common. Sometimes within a staff in larger churches, inter-staff conflicts. Sometimes it's member versus member. Sometimes it's the church and the community. I've seen that where the community, there's, a neighbor or, some other entity in the community that's often it's property or something like that. So sometimes that's the conflict. Sometimes it's between the congregation and the presbytery. There's a difference of opinion in how something should be done or has been done. Sometimes there's conflict between a pastor and his or her spouse, and they're having an ugly divorce or something, and so the committee on ministry gets sucked into that sometimes. Or I've also seen where the pastor's spouse causes conflict in the congregation by what he or she says or does, can really get into it with some of the members of the church. So, I mean, any way that you can think of, people are going to find conflict. And sometimes they will surprise you. So what are some crises that come up? Maybe you've experienced these, or maybe you've just heard about them.
The church split. I can speak from experience.
Yes. Yep.
When they want to remove a pastor and don't feel comfortable with that pastor, but not all of the church is on board.
Right. So,
The minister dies.
yep,
Suddenly running out of money?
yep. Financial crisis, unpaid bills, unpaid payroll, death of a pastor, a musician sometimes, or a prominent member. Things just sort of get out of control quickly.
A pandemic.
There you go. Yep. Pandemic. There's a crisis. Whoops. There's a crisis of what to do next. Sometimes it can lead to the financial concerns. There's sexual misconduct. There's financial misconduct. Sometimes there's people helping themselves to the church's money.
Disasters,
I'm sorry?
natural disasters, floods, fires, tornadoes.
Fire, flood, tornado. Sometimes it's a building or property issue, like the roof suddenly falls in or starts leaking or whatever, or a porch or a sidewalk or something. There's a crisis over a major expense of something. Maybe there's an injury on the church property. I've seen that. Or I also have seen a church in crisis because they have an immigrant member who's been picked up by ICE, or I've seen other churches where there's been an ICE sweep in the community, and that really has affected multiple members of the church. So there's all kinds of ways that churches can find themselves in a crisis. So what should you do as a liaison? Well, the most important thing you can do is stay connected. Just be as present as you can, because by now they know you. They know that you're a go-to person that they can count on. So if you're the one who finds out that there's something going on, then what you should do is advise the presbytery executive, if you have one, the committee on ministry chair, and the stated clerk. Because those are probably the three people who are most likely to be involved and help you make decisions. Find out what skills or resources are needed. If it's a fire, or if it's a natural disaster, what is it that they need help with, as far as like insurance, or helping with cleanup or whatever. So finding those things out, and then making sure that you know what the presbytery has to offer. If it's conflict, maybe mediation, or referrals to someone who can do the mediation. The synod, we have connections with the synod leaders, synod stated clerk, who can be really helpful. GA resources like Presbyterian Disaster Assistance are very helpful, and that has to be, the help has to be requested through the presbytery. The Office of General Assembly has people who are there to help with constitutional interpretation. They're very helpful, especially like if there's a church split, or something, or if it's a sexual misconduct, they can be really helpful in directing, how you should handle that. There's also an Office of Immigration Issues. So if there are questions you have about anything related to immigration, they can be really, really helpful. Again, the most important thing to do is, whether there's conflict or crisis, is just to stay connected and to help the church connect with the presbytery and the resources that the presbytery has to offer. But also, you know, depending on what it is, maybe it's an opportunity to help name the reality that led to this issue without blaming them, but, you know, help them to sort of look at their reality, and it may be an opening for change or experimentation or something. So never waste a good crisis if there's something good that can come out of it. So what questions do you have? Is there anything that Lackawanna does differently, or resources that you have that you could share with us?
I don't think that we do anything differently than you do. We may actually be a little bit more relaxed in our connecting. I think we probably are more relaxed in our connecting with our churches, so we don't always know when they're in crisis until it's major crisis. And then it feels like we don't have an exact either right now. So then it becomes a kind of a scramble of how do we help them?
Yeah.
Which is a challenge.
It is. Well, and that's sort of why I think it's important to stay in touch, to be connected along the way, so that you don't get surprised when there's, because oftentimes there are hints, there are ways that you can tell that something's amiss. And if you're just staying pretty connected, then you're not surprised when something big comes up.
I guess, Rhonda, one of the questions I have, and it's sort of related, sort of not related to this. What is your COM's policy when a pastor leaves a church and their connection with that community, that church? It seems that we have some rumblings in our community, in our presbytery right now, as some pastors have transitioned away from their church, whether they are connecting still in a way that they should or shouldn't. Which can cause a crisis when the old pastor is contacted rather than the new.
Right, and that does cause a crisis and conflict. We don't have anything that clearly right now spells that out. There is a what is it? Pastoral ethics. The
separation ethics.
Yes, it's a policy.
A policy.
But it's included in the ethics policy. So it's like a paragraph in the policy, but
right,
it's policy, and it's at the time of the exit interview. It is always reviewed with the pastor. And we hold firm on that. I mean, we did when I was stated clerk, because we had some issues with some lovely, honorably retired pastors who were giving us tremendous trouble by going back to churches just to worship, but because they felt they knew everything, they kept interrupting and intervening and getting in trouble that way.
Right.
But the pastor actually leaves his call. It's spelled out very clearly that they are not allowed to have any contact whatsoever with any of the members of the congregation for a minimum of 3 years. And even after that, it's not encouraged. It's hard for them because they have a lot of personal friendships. And we don't follow them around, but we also would be hearing from other members of the congregation that so-and-so had dinner with so-and-so or whatever. But you just have to keep reinforcing that you have agreed to this.
Yeah. Well, and likewise, it's important to make sure that the congregation, the session, signs off on that, because they have to help enforce it as well if they know that congregants are reaching out to the pastor the former pastor. We just went through this with a church here, and that's why I was asking you, Marcia, because when we were looking at the policy, it seemed like there was a newer policy that wasn't quite as specific as that one. And
part of the reason I think is because the question of Facebook came up. That has become social media has become sort of a newer aspect to that. That pastors have connections with their old congregants via Facebook. And I was clerk at the time of a transition, and I actually monitored the Facebook pages as clerk, to make sure that there wasn't any kind of complaining or conflict going on, so to speak. Because we did have a discussion with that, I think, before Marcia came on in our COM meeting, that you can certainly give them the policy and they can certainly read the policy, but you can't force a pastor to cut off. I mean, you can't monitor Facebook, or you can't monitor Instagram or whatever these other social things are, and basically say, you can't get off of them. I mean, I actually had a conversation with the pastor, and he was very respectful about the whole thing. So it never became an issue for us. But I could see where it can, if the congregation is going to that old pastor looking for answers or complaining or whatever.
It's also important for COM to encourage a retiring pastor to, or even one who has just announced that he or she is leaving, to give a sermon or include in a sermon Sunday morning what the Presbytery's policy is, and this is what's expected of you.
Right.
As I'm leaving, you're not allowed to be in touch with me. And oftentimes when it comes from the pulpit, people listen, people get it.
Right.
Yeah, our retired pastor was very because we also had a retired pastor, and he was very good in putting that line down and saying, you can't come to me, and
yeah, but all of them aren't that good.
No, but many of them, by the time they're retiring, they do just want to walk away and make sure that nobody is contacting them. So it depends on the individual.
Right. One of the presbyteries that I worked in before, there was actually a statement that was that the church was asked to put in their newsletter and their bulletin that said, here is the policy, and just so that people saw it and knew that that was something that was expected. So, yeah.
This is Amanda. I just kind of have a question. Is there ever any discussion of, or it's not like the Committee on Ministry needs more to do, but what people can offer these retiring pastors and help to replace the relationships they've had for the past how many years, or any kind of preparation for retirement to, it's almost like an orientation for retirement. I don't know. I just wondered if there's ever any talk of anything like that.
Well, the Board of Pensions is pretty good about doing that kind of thing. They offer workshops, and they're good about helping pastors in going into retirement prepare financially and with benefits, and also sort of emotionally. But I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. I know pastors do, what am I doing here? Do get together. Retired pastors get together, and we try to gather that we did try to gather them before COVID to just, talk to each other and socialize and, sort of develop fellowship, that kind of thing.
That might be a nice thing for the three presbyteries to do together once we get to the other side of COVID.
Yeah.
Give people a chance to, because I think it is good to, I know as a pastor, I do better when I get to share what's going on in my life with other people in similar places. And I could imagine that might be good if you're retired to share with other people what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And somebody that you can share, what you miss, what you don't miss, that kind of thing. Yeah, that would be a good thing to do. And we, the next session, we'll talk more in depth about transitions and what a liaison's responsibility is during a pastoral transition and the whole search process and all of that. So, as well as talking about, doing those triennial or whatever we want to call them visits, because I really think they're important to get in there and really have conversation with a session on a regular basis. So I really like this comic. Church is really a lot harder than it used to be. Churches of all sizes and shapes are struggling, and they need to make changes. They need to be in the 21st century, but they don't want to change. And hopefully through Committee on Ministry Connections, we can help them see that we want to partner with them to be the best they can be, and to help them do God's work in the world. So, I don't have anything else for today. If there are questions, then I'm happy to have a conversation, but I hope it was helpful.
I just want to thank you, Rhonda, for being able to facilitate this and get us all talking. I think that's the biggest thing, and open up some lines of communication and being able to, have this conversation and see what we need to work on. I think that's the biggest thing. And I think all of us as COM members, we're just trying to figure out the best way to serve our presbyteries and our congregations.
Right.
So the next session's going to be a little bit more specific about helping through the transitional phase.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot. And so I didn't want to try to do that.
No, that's fine. That's great.
Today. So.
I just want to echo, thank you very, very much. I have found this helpful. It's very, yes.
Okay, good.
So well organized. It clarifies things.
Okay. And if there are any of this, I can share the slides if it would be helpful. Yeah. So
yeah, I would like the slides. That was going to be my question. And thank you very much, Rhonda. This was really great.
Okay. All right. Well,
yeah, Rhonda, thank you for including Lackawanna, and
yes.
Thanks for the book recommendation, because I will order that quickly.
Okay. All right. Again, it's very short and simple, and a good thing to look at. So. All right. Well, thank you all, and peace be with you, and be in touch if there's anything I can do to help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.